Hello and welcome to the first edition of our 2020 EdjSports Head Coach Rankings. I'm Ian O'Connor and I'm joined by EdjSports co-founder Frank Frigo and Football Outsiders editor-in-chief Aaron Schatz. Now, before we get into our rankings and looking at some of the best and the worst decisions of the season so far, we want to get into our methodology, let you know exactly what it is that we're judging these coaches on and what they're being ranked for. So Frank, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, what makes these coaches rankings really special is it incorporates two specific areas that are really the best of EdjSports and Football Outsiders. So we look specifically at, first, how coaches make decisions in critical situations. These are often fourth downs where there's a lot of win probability or game winning chance, GWC as we call it, riding in the balance. We grade them by custom simulating those situations and seeing how much a decision, a good decision or a bad decision, affected the win probability of the game. So those are done by including the offensive and defensive pass and rush traits of those teams, simulating the game to conclusion, and seeing what the comparative win probabilities are on a critical decision. So if we're deciding between a punt and going for a fourth and short situation, we can look at the impact that decision made on the outcome of the game. We also incorporate the overall power index of the teams because we want to see who these coaches are as decision makers, but there's a lot more to being a coach than that. And Aaron's going to talk about those components that go into that. But we also want to look at them more holistically about the team they put on the field, the way they execute, and a whole host of other decisions that go into whether a team is successful throughout the season or not.
Yeah, the EPIs are based on Football Outsiders DVOA ratings. And it's important to note they're based on the ratings for the whole season. So they encompass what a coach was able to do with the talent that he was given. There's no adjustments for having backup quarterbacks in certain games or anything like that. It gives a little bit more weight to certain parts of the game that are a little bit more predictive, like pass offense, a little less weight to special teams. And that, by measuring how good the team has been overall, we're measuring some of the things in coaching that aren't incorporated in the critical coach index, like things like, inspiration, motivation, play calling, management of your personnel. That being said, we should note that this is not compared to expectations. So we're not giving coaches any kind of extra bonus for exceeding preseason expectations. Brian Flores, for example, in Miami, we base things on how well Miami has played this year, not the fact that Miami is much better than was expected before the season.
And one other thing I want to add about the decisions that we're grading is we don't play results. We take the best available information at the point of the decision. What was the game state? And what were the options that were available to the coach? So often in a fourth and short situation, if we're comparing to a field goal or to a punt, these are effectively directional choices. So a coach is making a conscious decision to go for it or to kick the field goal or to punt. And we can do a comparative analysis of those two things. If they decide to actually go for it on the fourth and short, now certainly, rushing or quarterback sneaks are often chosen in those kinds of situations. But we're really not grading them on that specific execution of the play choice that they make. It's more about the directional choice and how it affects the outcome of the game.
Great. Yeah, so now that we've got kind of an idea of what we're looking at, what these coaches are being judged on, now we're going to get into some of the best and the worst decisions of the season before we get into the actual rankings. So the best decision of the season goes all the way back to week 2. It was Andy Reid. He's still atop this list. So far, it was an overtime against the Chargers. The second drive of the game, it was 4th and 1 at the Chargers 46. They were obviously tied. He went for it. And it increased their pre-snap win probability or game-winning chance by 20.4%. Frank, why don't you talk about this one a little bit?
Yeah, so this is a classic example of a very highly leveraged situation. When you are in overtime, these types of decisions become very, very impactful because so much is riding on who gets that first score. Here, there could be conventional wisdom where a coach might say, let's try to pin them deep and get the ball back. But here, Reid is recognizing that with this offense, he's a big favorite to convert this first down. And if he does, he retains his touchdown prospects on the opening drive. And what you see here is a 20% impact on this decision, which is enormous when you think about that, right? If, in a 16-game regular season, if you faced a decision like this and got it right every time, you're talking about it impacting more than 3 wins in a season for an average team. So this is a really big choice, very highly leveraged, and he got it right.
It's interesting to note, by the way, that people complain about the play calls, and they complain about, well, what if you're down to your backup and can you really run the ball and whatever? Even though he had Patrick Mahomes, Andy Reid chose to run on this play, and he did it with his third-string running back, Darwin Thompson, and they picked up the first down.
Yep, and actually before that, the drive right before that was pretty interesting as well. There was a decision that actually went the opposite way. When Anthony Lynn had 4th and 1, he chose to punt. Was actually criticized by a lot of people, even his own fans. Understanding that it's Patrick Mahomes on the other side of the field, and that you got to take the risk and you have to retain possession if you want to beat him. So for our best, but now coming to the worst. And there's actually a coach that's got our 2 worst of the season. The first one, Kliff Kingsbury, back in week 9 against Miami. Late in the 4th quarter, just after the 2-minute warning, they were down 34-31. They had 4th and 1 on the Miami 31-yard line and chose to kick the field goal to attempt to tie the game, which cost them 21.2% pre-snap game-winning chance, or GWC. What was going on there?
Well, this is an example of where the coach is, I call these the temporary beauty type of decisions, where, your highest probability of scoring and taking the lead temporarily is to kick the field goal. But you really need to be thinking about these decisions in the context of winning the game. There still is 1 minute and 58 seconds left. You're not guaranteed to make the field goal. You're a big favorite to convert the 4th and 1. And in the context of winning the game, if you can convert this, now eat up more clock and kick the field goal at a more advantageous time, or even drive all the way down into the end zone. So these are, again, because it's late in the game, because the score is tight and the yardage is very short, these are super highly leveraged situations with a lot of GWC riding in the balance. And you can see that Kingsbury got this wrong, and it's a very costly decision on average.
Coaches need to remember that the point of the game is not to take a lead, nor is it to get to overtime. You play to win the game. That's why you play. You don't play just to play it. So I think with these decisions, there's a couple of things going on. First, the fact is that even if you tie with Miami in that week 9 game, you're giving them roughly 2 minutes to come back and kick a field goal back on you and win the game. The other is that the chances of converting a 4th and 1 are probably just as good, if not better, than your chances of hitting a 49-yard field goal. Once you get up near 50 yards on the field, those field goals are not easy.
Yep, and another interesting – Frank, yes.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, and the other thing is you have to think about what you're trading in yardage for that when you are unsuccessful, right? So –
right, you move the play 8 yards back. If you miss the field goal, you're giving the other team another 8 yards that they wouldn't have had if you had failed on 4th and 1.
Correct.
Yep, and that one is actually interesting as well. The previous drive for Arizona, they actually went for it on 4th and 1 twice. He converted the first one around midfield. The second one, they were tied, had a chance to take the lead on a field goal. He went for it. They did not convert. Miami went down, took the lead, and then he was back in a very similar situation. The number 2 error I mentioned is also Kliff Kingsbury, which just happened last weekend against New England. Pretty much the same situation. 4th quarter, just under 2 minutes left, 4th and 1 at the New England 27. This time they were tied. He again chose to kick the field goal, cost him 20% GWC pre-snap. So really, aside from those 2 decisions, Kingsbury has been really good. It's just we can't really ignore those late game errors that really cost them 2 games, essentially.
Yeah, he apparently didn't read our analysis of the first one when he encountered it the second time. So doomed to repeat.
Yeah, and remember that we're making our judgment here based before the field goal is actually kicked, right? So Arizona missed both of these field goals, but our judgment on the decision is based on the probability that that field goal is hit by Zane Gonzalez, not the fact that it was missed. The fact that it was missed just makes things worse.
That's right.
Absolutely.
We look at a broad distribution of outcomes, and that's the beauty of using a tool like ours where we can custom simulate the game to the conclusion, because we're accounting for the entire distribution of events. So when those field goals are made, when they're failed, when the fourth down is converted, when it's not, even when there would have been a turnover on the play, all of those different possibilities are considered in the proper frequency. And when you weight it all together, it just becomes glaringly clear that these decisions are costly.
So we'll see if where Kingsbury comes in our rankings, and if he can learn from these couple mistakes and maybe stick true to his aggressiveness that we see earlier in games from him. And now for a couple interesting decisions. One is an interesting error that was made. Another is an interesting good decision that was made that aren't in the those top two for each. And the bad one, the error, was Matt LaFleur. He also has actually been pretty sound aside from a couple errors this year. And this one is one of those. And this was very controversial. Frank, actually, you've had a couple interviews about this one, have written about it, and Packers fans were not happy. Back in week 10, the Packers were facing the Jaguars. It was about 2.5 minutes left in the fourth quarter. Faced 4th and 1 on their own 23, leading by 4 points. This one cost them about 18% pre-snap GWC on this one. It was against the Jaguars. So what's going on with this one?
Well, this one defies conventional wisdom, right? You look at this situation, you say, you've got the ball in your own territory. You've got a 4-point lead. It's a 4th and short. Nobody goes for it in this situation. But again, what we talk about the context of, you make these decisions to win the game, not to look good on that play, right? Not to postpone gratification. I mean, this is about winning the game. So if you look at this situation, and even if you could make the argument that Green Bay wasn't converting well in 3rd and 4th and short yardage situations, they didn't need much of a success rate here to justify this. In fact, we did a deep analysis on this, and they only need something like in the high teens of a successful conversion rate on that 4th down to justify it. We even stretched the assumptions so far on this one that we looked at, even if Green Bay knew they could do a miraculous punt and down it on the 1-yard line, the equivalent conversion rate of the 4th down that would be required was still only around 55 or 56%. An average NFL team is going to convert a 4th and 1 probably close to 70% of the time. So while it looks scary and it looks really bad when you fail here, because now look what happens. Jacksonville's already almost in the red zone, trailing by 4, and they need a touchdown. But there's a lot of components to this that the model and the simulation are picking up on, which is Jacksonville still needs to get it into the end zone. If they do get it in the end zone, Green Bay could potentially have a final drive coming back the other direction. And the fact that, as scary as it is, when they convert this, their win probability just jumps through the roof. So it's highly volatile, it's highly leveraged, but it's clearly right. And yes, the Packers fans did not like this analysis and didn't necessarily agree with it, but it's pretty sound.
Yep, and a lot of the feedback that we got on that one, and Aaron, you can probably speak to this, was the fact that a lot of people do watch the games. You obviously haven't seen Green Bay's 3rd and short and 4th and short execution. A lot of talk around the Jaguars quarterback was Jake Luton, making his 2nd NFL start. But that's all in the past. The fact that Luton is quarterback, is here today. But Aaron, what is your response to those kind of criticisms?
Well, first, as far as the execution on 3rd and 1 and 4th and 1, I think we learned more from how good the Packers offense is over the course of an entire season than we do on a handful of plays in that game. As far as Luton goes, Luton's inability to move the Jaguars offense is the same whether the Jaguars get the ball with 25 yards to score or whether they get the ball with 65 yards to score. So, I mean, it's something that we incorporate into our simulations.
Yep, and another thing in that one was the weather. And I know, Frank, we talked about this with the wind. Both teams have to play in the same conditions.
Yeah, they do, and that weather also affects the punt. In fact, again, we don't play results. This analysis was done pre-snap. This was a 30-yard net punt, so they were basically starting this drive at midfield after this. So all of those considerations, all of those types of naysayer arguments and counter cases, we can account for those in the simulation. And we do. We make those adjustments. We rerun the simulation to see how it affects the decision. And this one, it's really hard. You just can't come up with any underlying assumptions that push this the other direction. Even though it bucks conventional wisdom, it's really clear.
Yep, and like we said with LaFleur, he has been pretty sound this year, aside from this one and another decision or two. So we'll have to see where he comes in our rankings. But now into something a little bit more positive. A good decision this year that was interesting actually just came this past weekend. Fourth quarter, 49ers and Rams, about 35 seconds left. The Rams had used up all their timeouts. San Francisco still had all three, and they faced 4th and 1 on the Rams' 39-yard line. Chose to go for it instead of a 57-yard field goal for Robbie Gould. That increased the 49ers pre-snap win probability by 12.1%. That's not something you really see a lot of coaches do in that situation.
No, this is not at all obvious. Again, highly leveraged. They have an opportunity, big favorites to convert for the first down. They've got 3 timeouts remaining. Right now, they'll be able to potentially get a much better position on the field goal, eat up the remainder of the clock. If they do flunk, the Rams had no timeouts. They still got a lot of work to do for them to get back in field goal range. So if you look at the risk reward of this, you can see why this actually works out. A 57-yard field goal is far from a guarantee. So I think they made a really clear choice here, and the model supports it.
And it ended up working out for them because they converted with Kyle Juszczyk and they made it 15 more yards. And then they ended up with a 42-yard field goal instead of a 59-yard field goal, which is a much easier kick, which they made.
And the thing I want to point out too is, often we hear, well, we get it. You should be more aggressive on 4th downs. And often teams should. But so much of it is situational. You have to take into account the score, the ball position, the clock, who the opponents are. They're not all the same. Usually you get a lot more value by being more aggressive in these situations, but not always. And you have to look at it in its proper setting.
And in this situation with the 49ers, pretty much all year, they've been decimated by injuries. That Rams team has been very good. How much does that factor into these decisions? You've got a team, that is an underdog in the game. They've had injuries. They've been struggling against a good team. Or if it was the opposite, how much does that factor into those decisions throughout the season?
It factors in a little bit, I think, because the better team would be expected to win in overtime. So if San Francisco is the better team, their chances of winning in overtime are higher if they go to overtime. That being said, I still think that if San Francisco was the better team, the decision here would have been to go for it.
Frank, did you have something to add on that as well?
Well, just that we can account for those types of things. We have the ability to adjust the strengths and the weaknesses of the team, and we can stretch assumptions. Again, we can look at that. We can say to ourselves, what if their rushing offense is, what we've witnessed over the last several weeks? What if it's something far worse than that? And we can see how those assumptions affect the decisions. And we always do look at that.
Great. Awesome. And now, finally, we're going to move on to the main event, and that's the reveal of our top 3 coaches so far this season. Again, this is through 12 weeks. Coming in at number 3 is Frank Reich of Indianapolis.
Yeah, remember a couple of weeks ago against Tennessee, Frank Reich went for it on a number of 4th and 1s, and they did not pick them all up. But the fact that he was aggressive and willing to go for it is what matters. And he's been very aggressive this year, and it's very good. And obviously, he was in Philadelphia when they won the Super Bowl, and they got a lot of credit for being aggressive, and he brought that with him to Indianapolis.
Yep, and I believe the game you mentioned, the Tennessee game, I think it was like 5 4th downs where he went for it. It ended up being, I think it was around 19% GWC gain pre-snap just on those 5 decisions alone. So he's been very good. He always seems to find himself atop these lists and in our coach rankings as well. Number 2 is the guy Frank, yeah.
I was going to say he really does embrace analytics, Frank Reich. We know this. And what I really like about him too is, he doesn't apologize when it doesn't work out. He owns it. And I think he recognizes that if you consistently make these kinds of decisions, it pays off in the long run. And that's what you're seeing in Indianapolis right now.
That's who we got. We just discussed him for a bad reason. We did say he's been pretty sound this year, and that's Matt LaFleur of Green Bay in his second year as a head coach.
Yeah, LaFleur's having a great season. Certainly, we were critical of this decision that we mentioned a moment ago, but it was a really difficult decision. It was not obvious. It bucked conventional wisdom. Certainly, some win probability was left on the table there, but he's been doing really well. There's been a lot of very good decisions that he's made throughout the season, and it's kind of hard to argue, with where they're at in the rankings right now.
And as far as EPI goes, Green Bay is 8-3, just like they were 8-3 at the same time last year. But their EPI is much higher because they've been performing. The underlying play-by-play performance has been much better this year than it was last year.
And then for the number one coach, he actually finished in our top three last year in the final rankings of 2019. That is Andy Reid of Kansas City.
Yeah, a lot of people wonder about Andy Reid because he wasn't always perceived as a coach that embraced analytics and was this kind of a decision maker, but he has really improved over the last couple of years. Does really well. He's putting a quality product on the field, but not only that. I mean, it's one thing to have that type of an offense, but it's another to know how to use it correctly in the right situations. Now, he did have us scratching our head a little bit this past week when on the opening drive, he kicked a field goal on the, inside of the 1 yard line. But overall, he's been definitely hitting his spots well.
It's interesting because the top teams, as far as the EPI goes, are very different as far as the critical coach call index. And that is because you have Reid in Kansas City, where Reid had historically been conservative, but has been very nicely aggressive this year. And then you have Sean Payton in the New Orleans Saints, where Payton has historically been very aggressive, but has been very conservative and made a lot of bad fourth down decisions this year. So even though those two teams have both been really good as far as the on-the-field product, they come out very differently in our coach rankings because Reid has just been making much better in-game decisions.
And with an offense like that, I mean, you really can't blame him for not going on just about every single fourth down. It wouldn't be surprising to see him keep that offense on the field at 4th and 8, 4th and 9, 4th and 10. So we'll definitely keep an eye on these, see how these three coaches, if they can stay in the top three. We would expect them to stay, in the top 5 if they continue this trend. But a lot can happen, with these coach rankings in the next few weeks. What kind of things should we expect to see, till the end of the season, basically through week 16 when we conclude these rankings, Frank?
Well, yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch because, these opportunities arise and sometimes teams find themselves in very close late game situations or overtime where there's a lot more cost riding on these types of decisions. So it's every week this thing crystallizes more and more. And to the point that you just made a second ago, Ian, it can be easy to look at a team that's having success and has a powerful offense and say, sure, if I had that quarterback, if I had that running back, I'd be going for it on every fourth and short situation. But actually what we find is that often that puts them under a much greater scrutiny where they have the ability to make bigger errors. This is something we saw with John Harbaugh last year. He was performing really well in situations where that offense was, according to our analysis, required to go for something aggressive where a different offense might not have been, right to do so. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this develops here over the next few weeks and whether these coaches hold their positions. There's certainly a number of coaches that could end up as our coach of the year after week 16.
The other thing I'd say is that it's important to remember that the EPIs are adjusted for opponents. So the fact that certain teams might have easier or harder schedules in the last month of the season will not affect how we rate their coaches. Tampa Bay could win the next 4 games against an easy schedule, and we'll end up rating them the same as they've been rated for having close losses to hard teams in the last few games.
Absolutely. And it'll be interesting just to see how these things shake out. Like you guys said, over the next few weeks, we'll crown our coach of the year after week 16, just because not every team plays a meaningful game in week 17. So these rankings will just judge these coaches through 16 weeks. You can see the full rankings on our website at edjsports.com. You can see the best and the worst decision for each coach throughout this season so far. And be sure to check back weekly to see the rest of these rankings and how they update each week.